All right, now I'm recording and we haven't missed that much because I do record every class session and I post it afterwards. So if you miss the class, that's fine. You can go back, you can see the recording. So all of that is going to be based on Blackboard. Class materials, the textbook is Introduction to Software Testing. This is the second edition, the red one, not the older, kind of like lime green one by Paul Ahman and Jeff Offit. I don't super care if you get the textbook or not, but I think that the course will be a lot harder if you don't have access to the textbook. In the past, there have been a number of students who have gotten the electronic version of the textbook. I think that's probably pretty handy because it's really easy to look things up and find things. The syllabus, we'll talk more about the syllabus in a few minutes. The syllabus, lectures, the in-class exercises, quiz reviews the week after the quiz. Those are all going to be posted on Blackboard. Typically, they're going to be posted the day before class. So before class on Monday, I'm usually going to get the lecture slides and everything up for the week, probably by Sunday evening, maybe occasionally Monday morning. But they will be loaded on there on Blackboard before start of class. So you have the slides directly, you can download them and you can go along with me. If you look at my personal website, you can also find prior materials. So there are recordings from prior semesters on there. If you want to look ahead and see what's coming next, you're welcome to do that. I will say that I do change the course contents just a little bit every semester. Typically, it's just small refinements, things that where I find there's been some confusion. I try to clarify things. So the presentations that I give this semester will not necessarily be exactly what you'll see from past offerings. Here's our class schedule. Excuse me. This is in the syllabus, which is on Blackboard. Basically, we're every Monday night, except not 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now is Labor Day. There's no Monday class that week. So we get our break early in the semester. And then week 7, I guess that's going to be, well, now I forget. I guess that's Columbus Day, unless we're not calling it Columbus Day anymore. But there is no, the Monday is the holiday, but because we've already had a Monday off, it's Monday classes held on Tuesday. So that week 7, we're going to be on Tuesday, not on Monday. We've got one reading week on the December 5th and then final exam on December 12th. Final exam will be regular time on Zoom, same thing as always, right? 4:30 on December 12th. Office hours. I'm not at Mason. I don't keep regular office hours. If you'd like, we can talk before class or talk after class, although usually by the end of class, I'm pretty eager for dinner. But if we have a short conversation, I'm happy to have that with you after class. We can email, we can set up an appointment to have a, to have a Zoom call, whatever you'd like. I'm happy to talk with you. I just don't have regular hours. Ridwan, our TA, his office hours will be Mondays from 2 to 3. He does not have a location yet. Once I get a location, I'll update the syllabus and put a note in Blackboard so that you know what his office hours are. So a typical class. We get together, we start at 4:30. There's typically going to be about 10 minutes of quiz or assignment review from the prior week. I'm not going to go over the prior quizzes in detail, but I will kind of breeze over them. And if I can, I'll try to point out where people have, what kinds of mistakes people have commonly made on the previous quiz. Then we'll do our lecture that's normally about an hour. It's going to go to 5:30 or 5:45. Then we'll take about a 10-minute break. And then we'll do our in-class exercises. I try really hard and am usually successful at getting our class wrapped up by 7. So I'm not normally going to drag you out all the way to 7:10. We'll generally be done by 7. So let's talk about grading. Your grade comes from 4 different things. The biggest contributor to your grade is the weekly quizzes. There is a quiz every week, not including this week. Well, no, including this week, excuse me. There's a quiz every week, starting this week. Together, those count for 40% of your grade. There is no midterm exam. So it's weekly quizzes followed by the final exam. Those are your only tests. We have 6 assignments, 6 homework assignments over the course of the semester. Together, they make up 25%. of your total grade. I'm going to skip one here and say final exam next. Final exam is 25% of your grade. And then there's class participation. Class participation is 10% of your grade. I think I have a slide coming up on class participation that describes further what I'm looking for and what my expectations are. So your final grades, a 97 or higher is an A+, a 90 to a 96, or a 92, yeah, 90 to a 96 is an A, 85 to 89 is B+. You can see how it goes from there. Grades are absolute. I do not grade on a curve. I expect you to understand the material and demonstrate your understanding of the material. So let's talk a little more about quizzes. 40% of your grade. There will be a quiz after each class. There will be a total of 13 quizzes. From those 13 quizzes, I'm going to take your 10 highest scores, or looked at a different way, I'm going to drop your 3 lowest scores or ones that you missed. So your 10 best quiz scores will count to make up your quiz score. The quizzes are typically going to be based on the previous week's lecture, and particularly on the class exercises that we do. Quizzes are online on Blackboard. Importantly, they're open book, they're open notes, they're open any other resources. If you want to use Google or Stack Overflow or any other place you want to look, you can do that. My only expectation for the quizzes is that you do them on your own and that you do not directly ask or cooperate with other people to do the quizzes. The quizzes become available on Blackboard at the close of the class. So 7 o'clock tonight, the first quiz will be available on Blackboard. The quizzes are due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, right? So before midnight, before the midnight that borders Thursday and Friday, to try to make it really clear. That's a little less time than I usually give students during the semester. Usually they get probably an extra day. But in this case, because we're meeting on Monday, I need to give our TA some time to grade the quizzes. I do not want to insist to our TA that he work over the weekend. So the quizzes are due at the end of Thursday so that our TA's got some time to grade them. Quizzes are each 10 points. Sometimes, probably about half the time, roughly, there will be a 1-point bonus question on there that lets you demonstrate maybe a slightly deeper understanding of the topic. So I want to clarify that a little bit. That 1-point bonus question, that means that on your 10-point quiz, you can score possibly an 11, which means that you can end up with higher than a 100% score overall on your quizzes. That's great. Congratulations. You know, there's no nonsense about, well, it can take you up to a 10, but no higher. No, if you earned an 11 out of 10 on the quiz, then you earned an 11 out of 10 on the quiz. I do not offer makeup quizzes, right? If you miss the quiz, well, don't miss more than 3 would be my advice. I do understand that sometimes exceptional things happen. You know, I have been deployed to Korea or something, whatever. I've been hospitalized for 2 weeks, right? In extraordinary circumstances, talk to me and we'll see what we can work out. However, if you missed a quiz because, you know, your car didn't start or whatever, well, you know, you had from Monday till Thursday, I really only want to hear about extraordinary circumstances. Otherwise, write that off and consider it one of your low 3. Our assignments, there will be 6 homework assignments during the semester. I see a question in the chat. Are there time limits on the quizzes? Yes, there are time limits on the quizzes. The quizzes are typically 30-minute time limited. I do adjust them sometimes if I feel like, well, this is kind of a bigger question. So they're not necessarily all the same time, but they are time limited. So assignments. Each assignment is worth 10 points. Typically, I do not have bonus points available on assignments. As I mentioned earlier, the assignments are, the intent of the assignments is to give you a chance to apply that theory to a more practical example. You are welcome to do assignments in group. Any size group is allowed. If the entire class wanted to do the assignment as a group, you could do that. I don't recommend it. That does not work well, but you could. You can do it on your own. You can do it with one person. You can do it with 10 people. Question in the chat. Are quizzes coding or theory questions? The quizzes I do not ask you to do any coding at, or sometimes I may ask you to do some coding, but I'm not going to judge you on what I'm looking for is the content. So for example, if the quiz question was something like, you know, show a JUnit test that would do something, your grading is not going to be based on whether that compiles or runs. I'm looking for you to have an understanding of the concept. So for the most part, quizzes will not have coding. Assignments, for the most part, will have coding. In any event, you get to pick your group that you would like to work in. Historically, I would say that when I look at assignment scores versus group size, which I've done just out of curiosity because, you know, I like that sort of thing. I find the two peaks are either people who do the assignments on their own or people who do the assignments as a group of probably 3 is probably the best. And I'm not entirely sure why there are 2 peaks like that. I suspect that the people who are doing their assignments on their own really feel like they know what they're doing. But then 3 seems to be about the optimum number to have the right number of ideas that are contributing to it. So I offer that as, I don't know, guidance. I'll stop short of calling it advice. You can do whatever size groups you want. So assignments have a due date. Up until the due date, they are worth 100%. As of the start of class on the due date, they are now marked down by 50%. So if it was a 10-point assignment and you're past the due date, for 1 week past the due date, your maximum score is 5. You get to 1 week beyond the due date, and that assignment is now a 0. So it does really help to get those assignments done on time. As we go through the semester, the assignments get more in depth and more complicated, and as a result, they become worth more. So assignment number 1 is worth only 5% of the total assignment grade. Assignment number 6 is worth 30% of the total assignment grade. So I mentioned class participation earlier. Class participation is 10% of your grade. So how do you earn class participation points? I have tried very hard to organize this so that this is not difficult. How do you do this? Well, you can get, first of all, there are 2 points available every week. There is an in-class participation point available, and there is an online participation point available. So in class, you can earn points by leading your in-class group assignment or even just participating in your in-class group assignment. When we split up into groups, which we'll start doing next week, not this week, when we split up into groups, I typically jump around the groups and I just kind of make some notes about who's sharing the screen, who's leading it, who's giving, right, who's briefing the whole group afterwards, and who's contributing. I may not always get everybody, but I get you often enough. You might choose to present your group's exercise results to the rest of the class. That will get you your in-class point. You can, during class, during exercises, or online, ask, or even better yet, online answer a question about really anything relevant, right? Ask a question about the lecture material, the homework assignments, quizzes. Ask about anything related to software testing or software quality, or post some interesting article that you've come across related to software testing or software quality. Post that in Blackboard. Another great way to earn participation points is by finding errors in my slides and suggesting corrections. I've been using these slides for a while and I've cleaned up a lot of things, but it seems that every semester there's a few more things that just aren't quite right. And I appreciate you finding those things because I want my slides to be correct. So, you know, you're rewarded for finding those things by a participation point that week. Let's see, that gives you a total, I think, of 26 possible participation points total that you could earn over the course of the semester. 10 participation points will get you your full credit, right? So you do not need to participate in class and participate online every semester. As long as you're involved with the class, right, you can easily get those 10 points and score your full class participation score. That said, every semester I have people who do neither of those things, and they end up with 0 or maybe 1 participation point for the whole semester. You need to understand, with 10% of your grade, if you have not participated in class, your best possible grade is a B+, right? The A's are out of reach. So make sure you're participating. Final exam, 25% of your grade, that will be on Blackboard just like the quizzes. It will be longer than the quizzes, but will be the same kind of format. That's worth 100 points. It'll have a 5-point bonus question, again, to allow you to demonstrate a little bit of a deeper understanding of some topic or another. The exam is cumulative, so it can cover topics from the entire semester. Like the quizzes, it is open notes, it is open book, it is open other resources. I will decide towards the end of the semester what the time limit will be. I tweak the final every year and I adjust the time limits. Again, like the quizzes, the only requirement is you do it on your own. Unlike the quizzes, the exam will happen at a particular time, right? On exam day at 4:30, the final exam will start. You need to be aware of GMU's policy because I can't control that. An unexcused absence from the final exam is an automatic F. So if anything is coming up, please, please, please talk to me first, because I would hate for you to have a great semester and then get an F because you missed the final exam. That would be a bad thing. All right, will we be able to see where we stand on participation later in the semester in the Q&A? And the answer is yes. That's going to be a column in the Blackboard Grade Center that I will update every week. So you will see all through as we go, you will see what your participation score is. You'll know exactly where you stand. I try to keep everything as open as I can, right? I'm no interest in hiding from you any information. All right, so in-class exercises. In-class exercises are 0% of your grade, right? There is no scoring for this. But basically, we're talking about almost half of each class being devoted to this. These exercises are also going to be in groups. Unlike assignments, I will be assigning the groups for the in-class exercises. They don't get turned in. They don't get graded, although we generally do. Each group will brief to the whole class part of a question, like one part of the question. We will discuss them, so you'll get some feedback on it, but they're not turned in, they're not graded. The quizzes are typically going to be based on the previous week's exercises. I say typically because I'm not making any guarantee that if you did the exercises, that's exactly what's going to be in the quiz, but it tends to work that way. All right, back to the Q&A, and thank you for all these questions. I really appreciate the questions in the Q&A. Is it possible to get extra credit for participation? So that's a dirty little secret. At my discretion, I may decide at the end of the semester that the 1 or 2 or few students who have just had an extraordinarily high participation, they might get a little extra bump. I don't have a particular policy on that, but I may decide to do that at the end of the semester. So let's talk about attendance, and let's talk about my overall philosophy for this course, which is, hey, this is grad school. We're all big kids now, right? I don't take attendance. I don't want to say I don't care if you come to class, because actually I do care if you come to class for 2 reasons. First of all, I don't like talking to myself. And secondly, the people who come to class regularly tend to get better grades than those who don't. But if you miss a class, that's fine. Videos of every lecture are going to be available. You could choose to, okay, Monday nights is not good for me, but every Tuesday I'm going to watch the video. Right, you're going to do this asynchronously. That's fine. I'm fine with that. Do remember, though, class participation is 10%. So if you're not coming to class and participating in the live class, you have to be that much more diligent about earning your online participation points. There are enough opportunities that you can get your full 10%. You just have to be a little more diligent about it. So a few other topics. All of this is in the syllabus. I recommend that you read the syllabus. Those of you who have read the syllabus know why I recommend that you read the syllabus. And we can leave it at that. Disability accommodations. If you require disability accommodation, do not come to me. Go to the Disability Services Office. They will then work with me and we will decide what your accommodation is. GMU has a strict honor code. Again, this kind of goes back to we're all big kids now. I have had in the past several cheating problems on quizzes and exams. I take a very dim view of that, right? That's one of the few things that will really make me very unhappy. So let's make sure that we're adhering to the honor code and doing the work on our own when it calls for that. Discrimination, fairness, equal opportunity. I do expect that in class and in the chat and in the forums that we will all be treating treating our other participants in the class with respect. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about groups. Welcome to Bugwarts. So if this castle looks familiar to you, yes, I did just plain old steal it from Hogwarts. If it doesn't look familiar to you, well, there's a really good long book and movie series on the Harry Potter series, and we're kind of stealing a few ideas from there. So our in-class exercises, as I mentioned, will be done in groups. The group identities are going to be taken from this Harry Potter series of books and movies. So there's going to be Gryffindors, Hufflepuffs, Muggles, Ravenclaws, and Slytherins. When you take quiz number 1, the Bugwarts sorting hat right here is going to assign you into a group. And those are the groups that I'm going to split you up into to do the in-class exercises. That's the only purpose for this groups. Again, you can do assignments on your own with whoever you want. These groups are just for the in-class exercises. And for the Bugwarts House Cup, a little friendly competition. There are many ways to earn points, House Cup points for your group. So some of those ways are having the highest graded exercise, right? Or excuse me, I didn't mean to say highest graded exercise. Exercise aren't graded, but having the best work on exercises or the best briefing of your work. The first person who submits a quiz or an assignment, you can get a point for your group. The highest score on a quiz or an assignment gets even more points for your group. The highest final exam grade, finding slide errors, and extra credit as decided by me will get points to your group. The group who wins the House Cup at the end of the semester will get 1 extra point on their final grade. 1 extra point may not be that much, but if you had an 89.1, 1 extra point can be quite handy. Question in the chat, will the in-class groups remain the same for the entire semester? Basically, yes. I may find a need to shuffle groups around depending on whether, there's a certain randomness that's built into the quiz about how that assigns you into groups. If the groups end up very lopsided, I may need to reassign people to get the groups, back all kind of the same size. There is usually some attrition during the semester, right? There are some students that leave the class for one reason or another, particularly early in the semester. That may cause me to need to rebalance the groups so that, you're all kind of, it's not fair to have 9 people in one group and 2 people in another group. So I may need to make some adjustments, but other than that, the groups do remain the same over the course of the semester. All right, so that takes us to the end of the course overview. Any questions on what I've talked about or questions about what you want to know that I may not have talked about? Okay, well, I'm going to add one more thing that I realized I didn't have in the slides. I'm going to make a request, and my request to you is that when you're in the class, I'm going to request that you attend the class with cameras on. And I'm asking that mostly because that lets me feel like I'm talking to someone instead of staring at this little camera eye over my computer. And I do better work when I feel like I'm actually talking to someone. And also, I think that's a good way for people to, maybe get to know other people a little bit. Oh, yeah, I recognize her, right? And we all just feel a little more like we're in a class. I don't insist on it. There are any number of personal reasons by which you might decide, yeah, I really don't want to have my camera on. I may not have a suitable location. You may have privacy issues with it. I'm fine with that. That's why it's not a requirement. It's merely a request. All right, so let's move on then to our first actual content. Question in the chat: what is the reading that was mentioned in the syllabus? Are you talking about the last class or two at the end of the semester? I'm going to assume yes. Okay. Yeah, the syllabus does have 2 papers that we'll read at the end of the semester. I may make a change there and may use some other papers because those are getting a little dated by now. They're a few years old, but I will provide you those papers as we get towards that. Those are going to be papers about the current state of research and mutation testing. And so I will provide you them or provide you with links to them when we get closer to that time in the semester. All right, let's talk about why we test software. So what does testing look like? Why do we care about testing? So obviously, software defines behavior of actually many things, right? Defines the behavior of routers, defines the behavior of large financial networks or stock prediction or bank account management. Switching networks, right? Electrical, telephone, other infrastructure, right? Software is essentially everywhere at this point. The current software market is much bigger than it used to be, right? With more and more things being software driven. It's more and more competitive than it used to be. And there are far more users than it used to be. When I started my career, in the mid 1980s, software was something that software experts interfaced with. And few other people, right? Unless you were a computer engineer or a programmer or a data entry clerk or something like that, software was like, yeah, what's that? And then, that was really kind of right about when personal computers started to really come into the workplace and the home. But now everybody is interfacing with software all the time. I'm sure that each of you right now probably has half a dozen heavily software-driven devices within reach. You've got your phone, you've got your laptop or desktop that you're talking on. You probably have more than one phone. There's probably a gaming machine nearby, right? All of these things are driven by software. We have more and more things that are using embedded controls, right? Embedded control applications. Aircraft, air traffic control, cars, all of these are heavily software driven. And then even mundane things, if you're wearing a wristwatch, I know, Matt. So they're starting to maybe make a little bit of a fashion comeback, but not many people are wearing watches anymore because we've all got the time on our phones. But that's a relatively mundane thing. Well, I guess if you're an Apple Watch or a smartwatch, that's not so mundane, right? It's got a lot of software functionality. But even a regular wristwatch is now software driven. And so are things like ovens and refrigerators and dishwashers and garage door openers and lots of other things. So software is everywhere. We also have an introduction over the last decade or decade and a half of various agile processes, right? Trying to get faster turnaround of software. And that's putting a lot of additional pressure on testers and on testing. And so we have cases where programmers, right, software developers, they really need to unit test their software, except that they have little or no training or education in how to do that and why to do that and what to do. We have tests that are key to verifying that our system meets its requirements. But who builds those tests and what do they know about what they're doing? So there's really a continuing revolution going on about what testing means and how testing contributes to the success of software. A quote from a researcher at King's College, I think, in London, Mark Harmon. Software is a skin that surrounds our civilization. I don't know, it's kind of a weird quote, but I think that it really points out that virtually all of the things that we're interacting with now are software driven, or where software defines the behavior of these things that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. From the very complicated, you know, like an aircraft or your car's engine controller, to the very simple, like a traffic light or your toaster or coffee maker. So let's talk a little bit about terminology. And there are three terms that I want to introduce here that we'll use throughout the semester. The first term is a software fault. And a fault is a static defect in the software. So when we say fault, we mean there's a line of code in here somewhere that's not right. Then we can also have a software error. An error is an incorrect internal state of the software. That's a result of reaching the fault. By reaching the fault, I mean the program's execution runs the line of code where the fault is. And now there's some difference in the internal state of the software, right? A variable has the wrong value. The wrong branch was taken. Something has gone wrong in the software. And that can, but does not need to, result in a software failure. And a software failure is some externally observable behavior that is different from what we wanted the behavior to be. So we want to make sure that we're keeping those three terms distinct, right? A fault, a static defect, an error, an incorrect internal state, and a failure, an incorrect behavior that we can observe from the outside. So faults in software are equivalent to design mistakes in hardware, right? Hardware, a car engine, right? A fishing reel, whatever you have, some piece of hardware, that can degrade. It can wear down, it can wear out, it can break. Software does not degrade, right? Software, 50-year-old software runs as well as it did the day it was made, assuming you can find something to run it on. So software does not wear out, it does not degrade over time. So when we're talking about software faults, certainly feels like it does, yeah. So things change around it, right? I think we've all seen that. It's like, okay, well, why can't I run that game that I had when I was a kid, running Windows XP? Well, the software is fine, but things around it have changed so that it can't run in that environment anymore. But the software itself, right, that code doesn't change. Lines of code don't spontaneously break. So those faults are equivalent to things that we have done wrong when building hardware. Oh, I designed that gear the wrong way or something like that. So if we look at faults and failures, let's say I'm not feeling well. I go to my doctor. Oh, I feel a little dizzy. I have a fever. I've got this nasty cough. Those are failures. Those are externally observable behaviors or effects that are different from what my desired state is. So the doctor may look for internal conditions, right? Check my blood pressure, do a blood test, something. Looking for errors. What are differences in my internal state? And then if we can diagnose the root cause, well, you have COVID. Okay, well, that's the equivalent to the fault. Now, of course, this is a loose analogy. It's not really a perfect fit because most medical problems result from either external attacks, which COVID would fall into, or physical degradation, right? Hey, I'm getting older, I'm wearing out, things aren't working as well as they used to. And software doesn't really have that, right? Software faults are there at the beginning. They don't appear because things wore out. So let's look at a source code example. Here's a very simple little Java method that counts up the number of zeros in an array. So it's going to loop through the number of, it's going to loop through all of the elements of the array. And if the array element is 0, then it's going to add, it's going to increment count, and then it's going to return count at the end. All right, I got a question in the chat. Could a fault be induced because the language got updated? Okay, so a line of code that was written in an older version of the language has now changed. now that line of code maybe means something else. I think if that happened, I would consider the result to be a fault. That's a little bit of an edge case, but okay, good job on keeping me honest. Those aren't really the kinds of cases that we're going to be looking for, but I'm going to have to agree that, yeah, if I had something in, a very old version of C and now I compile it with ANSI C and there's some artifact in there that doesn't mean the same thing that it used to, okay, yeah, I'd consider that a fault. All right, let's get back to num0. So we've got our program here. There's a fault in this program. Can anyone see it offhand? Can, yes. The for statement starts with an index at 1. So Java arrays are indexed starting at 0, but our for statement initializes our index to 1 instead of 0. So there we go. There's our fault. So can we reach this fault? And when I say reach, I mean, can we get the code to execute this fault? Yes, sure we can. In fact, assuming we call this function at all, we cannot avoid reaching this fault, right? Because there's no way we can branch around it. There's no way we can skip it. If we call num0, we're going to reach and execute this fault. I answered my own question. I should read ahead. I should be more familiar with my own slides. Can we not reach this fault? No, we can't not reach the fault because assuming we call the function, we're going to hit the fault.
Well, if the array is empty, then it wouldn't hit it.
If the array is empty, actually, if the array is empty, it's still going to initialize I first before it checks I against the array length.
That's fair.
So even then, we will execute the fault. Yeah, we'll still reach the fault anyway. Can we cause an error and a failure? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, just give it any number of zeros in the array.
Just give it any number of zeros.
And
well, will any number of zeros cause an error and a failure?
No, it actually has to be a 0 in the first entry.
There you go. If we've got a 0 in the first element, right, a 0 at the start index, yep, then we'll cause an error because I will be wrong and count will be wrong. And then we're going to return count, which is wrong, and that causes a failure. So if we passed it, for example, 0, 1, 2, that will return 0, but it should have returned 1. Can we cause an error without causing a failure? So can we cause an error of the internal state without causing an observable problem? Okay, I'm hearing a couple of yeses. Yes, if the first index is a 1. All right, let's be a little more general and say, yeah, as long as the first element of the array is not a 0, then we'll still have an error of internal state because I will have an undesired value. It turns out it won't matter because as long as this first element of the array is not a 0, it will end up returning the correct count of zeros in the array. But there was an error of internal state because on the first execution of the loop, the intent was, or the proper functionality was, for I to be equal to 0, but instead it was equal to 1. And so it's actually quite common to be able to cause errors that don't result in failures, which is why software failures can seem spurious. It's like, well, every now and then this thing breaks. Why is that? Well, it's probably broken all the time, right? It has a fault all of the time, but maybe it doesn't reach the fault every time. And if it does reach the fault every time, maybe it doesn't cause an error every time. But if it does cause an error, maybe that error never ends up coming back to us so that we can detect a failure. So let's talk a little bit about bugs. and I'm kind of leading you on a side trip here, but it's kind of an interesting side trip. The term bug. So if we go back to 1843, we can read Ada Lovelace's notes on Babbage's analytical engine. And although she does not use the word bug here, she does very, I think, insightfully understand that the algorithmic instructions to the analytical engine could be wrong, which could cause it to function incorrectly. Right? Herein may lie a possible cause of error. Right? The cards may give it the wrong, even if the actual mechanism is unerring. Right? The actual mechanism works perfectly. The cards, the instructions, may give it the wrong orders. We can fast forward just a little bit to 1878, and we have Thomas Edison using the word bug, right? It is then that bugs, as such little faults and difficulties are called. So the term bug actually has a long, rich history that dramatically predates computing. Here is an ad for a game. This is not an electronic game. This is a game from 1931. No bugs in this game. So this was actually a pretty common and well-known term. I mean, to appear in an ad like this, I mean, this certainly would be a word that the baffle ball makers would think that people would understand. And here is perhaps the first actual computer bug being found. This goes back to 1947, the Harvard Mark II electromechanical computer, which experienced a processing failure. And when they opened it up and looked at it, they found a moth stuck in one of the relays. So the first, as it says here, first actual case of bug being found. So you can tell by that note in the, in the computer logbook that even at this time, they were well aware of the use of the word bug, meaning, some sort of small problem. So fun. But the problem with bug is that bug is an informal term. When someone says bug, what do they mean? Do they mean a fault? Do they mean an error? Do they mean a failure? Do they mean all of those things or just some of those things? Or do they even know what they mean? So all of this lead up is to say, we are, for the most part, not going to use bug in this class because we would like to use precise and well-defined terms. So we will be using fault, error, and failure. So there are plenty of examples of software failures and costly software failures. This document is very old at this point, right? The National Institutes of Standards and Technology, Economic Impacts of Inadequate Infrastructure for Software Testing, 20 years old, talking about software testing, poor software testing costing $22 to $59 billion in the US. We have seen at times huge losses due to software failures that could have been detected by testing. So $6.5 million per hour. That's a staggering number, right? Amazon's BOGO offer, buy one, get one, turned into a double discount. They paid you to buy something. Even as early as 2007, Symantec, a well-known software security or computer security company, is acknowledging that most security vulnerabilities are actually due to the software, no longer the system that's running it. So in maybe the 1990s, the answer to software security was, well, put it behind a firewall. But even in as early as 2007, there was this recognition that, well, that doesn't really solve the problem because the software vulnerabilities are in the software itself, not in the system that's running it. So let's take a look at a couple of my favorite spectacular software failures. If we go back to the mid-'80s, in what is, as far as I've been able to tell, and if you've got another case, I'd love to hear it. As far as I've been able to tell, the first case of software causing a human death. It's a radiation therapy machine that, because of an improper software safety lockout, delivered 100 times the amount of planned radiation, which killed 3 patients. So our first known software-caused fatality. 1996. 1996 was a bad year for space. Among the bad things that happened in 1996 were the European Space Agency's Ariane 5 maiden launch. It was their new heavy lift booster. They had cleverly reused the guidance software from the very successful Ariane 4 booster. However, what they did not determine through testing before launch was that the Ariane 5 had a somewhat different flight profile, right? It tipped over faster, it went downrange sooner and faster, and there was a numeric counter that measured the downrange distance, and it had an integer overflow. The integer overflow shut down the guidance system, resulting in destruction of the rocket. 1999 was even a worse year for space. We had NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter. Climate Orbiter was lost halfway between Earth and Mars when they tried to do a course correction, and part of the software was using pound-feet per second, and part of the software was using Newton seconds, right? Both measuring the same thing, but in different units, right? American units, or whatever we'd like to call them, versus metric units, which caused an improper course correction, and the spacecraft missed Mars. In 1999, also in 1999, excuse me, Mars Polar Lander was lost. As it was landing, there was software in there that would shut off the descent engine when the landing feet detected that they were on the surface. But in the course of extending the landing feet, there was some vibration in there. The vibration caused the landing detection switch to bounce up and down a few times, and the software did not properly filter that. And so it prematurely thought that it had landed, shut down the descent engine, crashed, and was destroyed. 2000 to 2009, there was a lot of stuff in the news about unintended acceleration in Toyota and Lexus vehicles. 89 people were identified as killed in accidents due to that problem. I had the opportunity to attend a conference some years ago now, where one of the speakers was an expert witness who was hired to evaluate the Toyota software. And without taking up too much time to talk about this, he described some of the things that he found. And at the end, he was asked, well, did you find the problem? And his answer was, we were unable to find the specific problem because there were just too many bad things in there. We couldn't decide which one might have caused it. So that's pretty frightening. 2003, massive Northeast US and Canada blackout. An overloaded electric line shut down in the area of Cleveland, Ohio. The monitoring software that was monitoring it had an improper, had a fault in it that resulted in a race condition, didn't properly announce the problem, and that led to cascading blackouts that blacked out 55 million people for a day or 2 days. 2007, this one's a little harder to confirm, but I believe this to be accurate. The first deployment of Air Force F-22 Raptors from Hawaii to Okinawa. As they crossed the anti-meridian, right, plus minus 180 degrees longitude, their navigation and fuel management systems shut down, and they had to visually follow their tankers back to Hawaii for a quick software patch. And perhaps the nastiest example of all of them, 2018 and 2019, 2 Boeing 737 MAX airliners crashed for a variety of reasons. Anytime you're looking at commercial aircraft accidents, they call it the Swiss cheese model, right? But it's like there's so many layers of different things that are trying to protect you, and all of those layers have to line up so that there's a hole right through all of them. So many bad things have to happen, and arguably these crashes were really more about inadequate flight crew training and criminally negligent maintenance, combined with a bird strike, combined with a number of other things. So it's not really the case that software caused these accidents, but it is the case that software could have prevented these accidents. So most of us here in this class are probably software engineers or looking to become software engineers or some role similar to that. And if we look at a case like this, you know, I'll ask you, well, what could you have done in your role? And you're not the pilot, and you're not training the pilot, and you're not doing the maintenance, and you're not trying to keep the airport free of large birds that shouldn't be there. But as a software or systems engineer, you do have a role in the system's design, and a better design of that system could have prevented these accidents, even if the software itself was not the proximate cause. And there are plenty more examples for those of you who look. And so while this is not an assignment, I'll suggest to you that a great way to earn an online bonus point over the next week or two would be to find an example of a bad software error that was dangerous or that was expensive or that was embarrassing, and post about that. Post about that on, on our Blackboard forum. QUWO radio glitch in Mazda this February was quite remarkable. So I'm not familiar with that. So I would love to read about that. So go ahead and post about that, and we can all, you know, we can all read that and learn a little more. All right, so what does it come down to? Well, it comes down to we need our software to be dependable. It runs virtually everything around us. Testing is one way to assess the dependability of software. And note that I'm phrasing that very specifically. Testing does not make software dependable. Testing determines or makes a measurement of the software's dependability. We cannot test quality into software, but we may be able to determine that software is not of sufficient quality by doing that testing. So as we move on further into the 21st century, I mean, yeah, we're already 20 years in, 22 years in, but, you know, hopefully we're all going to keep going. What happens to testing over this time period, right? In the time period that we all in this class are going to be interacting with software. Well, there are going to be more and more safety critical systems and more real-time software, right? We're seeing that for the last several years. Tesla and other companies are working on, you know, self-driving cars, right? Full autopilot. That's a safety critical software application if ever there was one. So there's going to be more and more of those things. Software is everywhere. Embedded software is everywhere. Like I said earlier, I'm sure that without moving from your seat, assuming you're sitting, you could put your hands on half a dozen or a dozen or more things that have embedded software in them. As more and more business applications and more businesses move to rely on software applications, be it websites or ordering systems or inventory management or whatever, there are bigger programs, they have more users, there's more opportunity for software problems to cause business problems. Security is now primarily about software faults. Another good thing, if you know of any particular software security vulnerabilities that have come out recently, it's another great thing to post about. I think we'd all be interested in seeing some of the things that are going on. But software security problems are being found in the source code, right? It's how do I put some inputs into this program that it doesn't expect, and then I can make it do something that I want it to do instead of something that it wants to do. And web apps and mobile apps, we've got new deployment platforms. They're very competitive. There are tons and tons of users. There's an expectation of high reliability. You know, I mean, I go on to the Google App Store or the Apple App Store, and I download something for free, and I expect it to work 100% of the time, exactly as it should. Maybe that's unrealistic for free, but those are user expectations that have to be met if that application is going to be successful. So what does this mean to us? Well, software and testing is getting more important, and that leads us to our questions. what are we trying as software testers? And I'm going to put us in that role, right? Whether or not that's what you really do, I'm going to put us in that role for the purposes of this class. As software testers, what are we trying to test? And what are our goals in doing that testing? So we can take a look at test process maturity, right? How do we look at testing? And at level 0 maturity, there's no difference between testing and debugging. And I know I've been here, you've probably been here. Well, how do I test the software? Well, I play with it, I run a couple of things that I made up, I see if it works, I fiddle around with it. You know, I have no particular testing goal, I have no particular testing criteria. I'm just sort of making up inputs as they occur to me. It's a completely ad hoc, informal process. We can look at level one maturity. In level 1 maturity, I'm feeling that as a tester, my purpose of testing is to show that the software is correct. However, while that sounds great, the problem that we run into is that software is sufficiently complex that it becomes impractical and perhaps impossible to show that it is correct in all circumstances. In the late 90s, as I was doing my master's program, there was a big push in research for software proofs and doing formal proofs of software correctness. It's an idea that has come around a few times. It'll probably come around again. The problem is it's like counting the number of atoms in the universe, right? There's no piece of software that I can build that can handle the complexity of analyzing an even relatively trivial piece of software for formal correctness. So we'd like to show correctness. It seems like a good idea. The problem is we can't do it. In level 2 software, we kind of reverse that. In level 2 maturity, excuse me. Now, as testers, the purpose of our testing is to show that the software doesn't work. I've got an idea of how to break this, and I'm going to throw it back to the developers and say, you screwed this up. Ha, ha, ha. That's effective, but it's also, right, it's not optimal, right? It sets up this wall, it builds this wall between the developers and the testers. We now have an adversarial relationship. You know, as a tester, I feel like my job is to prove the developers wrong. As a developer, my job is to sneak something past those pain in the butt testers, right? Because they're always just nagging on me about things, and what do they know anyway, right? So we have this antagonistic relationship that's set up, and that's really not good for anybody. So that can move us into a little bit of a more mature look where we can be at this level 3 of maturity. We can recognize, well, our purpose of testing isn't to prove anything specific because I can't prove that it's correct. And I don't really want the adversarial relationship of showing that it's broken. But what I do want to do is to reduce the risk of using that software. Well, now that seems realistic because anytime we've got some complex thing in the real world, there's risk to using it, right? If I get on an airliner and I'm going to fly from here to Dallas, there's risk to me doing that because things on that airliner could break. They break incredibly rarely. It's unbelievably safe, but it's not completely safe, right? There are risks. That said, I mean, if I go into an office building, I went up to the 5th floor of this office building. Well, there's a risk that this building could collapse. Again, it's a tiny risk, but it's a risk. So while we're testing software, we want to be identifying risks and reducing those risks. That sounds smart. Now it seems like we're on the right track. Last of all, we can get to kind of our highest level of testing maturity where we recognize, well, testing is that, right? It is about reduction of risk, but really it is now a mental discipline, right? It is a process that we follow as software developers, right? We have a process that we're going to follow on our own because we feel it's our responsibility, right? It is my responsibility as a software developer to develop high quality software. And so as I start to understand how I can test, I can integrate those testing ideas into the work that I am doing. and try to produce higher quality, lower risk software. Okay, well, I've largely said these things, so I'm going to skip these, except maybe a few points. Okay, level 0, testing and debugging. Yeah, this is kind of what we teach you, you know, in your freshman or sophomore class in programming, because we don't typically, with a few exceptions, we don't typically teach testing at that level. And so we build in that habit of, well, I tried a few things, it broke, I fiddled around with it, I don't know, it looks good now. Right? We could probably do a better job at the undergraduate level. So I'm going to largely skip these. You can look them over in the slide set, but I think I've mostly talked about these points. All right, so at level 4, right, we've got, as I said, a mental discipline. We've got testing as a way, one of possibly many ways to improve our software quality. Recognizing the importance of testing at this level also allows test engineers who formerly, right, those darn software testers, they're always complaining about something, right? They're kind of the lowest form of life on the software development team. Well, when we get to level 4 thinking and we recognize the importance and how things need to integrate together, those test engineers can actually be respected leadership roles on our program. And they can use their expertise to help the developers do a better job. All right, so, you know, where are you at your organization? That could be where you work. It could be you personally. You know, think about, you know, am I a 0? Am I a 1? Maybe I'm a 3. Part of our job, or part of my job, part of our job collectively as a class, is to really bring you to being a change agent for where you're working, or if you're not currently working, to change the way you're doing things and looking at that things. We want to make you an advocate for level 4 maturity thinking. So what are some things we want to think about when we're doing that? Of course, we're going to talk all semester long about level 4 thinking in kind of an indirect way. So this is just a scratch of the surface. But when we're writing tests or thinking about designing tests, we need to be thinking about why this particular test, right? For any test we want to do, why do I care about that test? And one of my favorite quotes from Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, then any road can take you there. So if I don't know what I'm trying to achieve, then sure, any test is good, I guess. But if I know what I'm trying to achieve, I can be more efficient and more effective in my testing, right? I can have documented test objectives. I can have expected coverage levels. We'll talk more about coverage. I think next week we start talking about that. But basically, it's a measurement of how thorough my testing is, right? Knowing that I can't prove software to be correct in a practical way, how much testing is enough? When do I declare success? There's a common objective, which is, you know, spend the testing budget or test until the scheduled ship date. That's sometimes called the date criterion. That is a common approach to testing, but it's not a very effective approach to testing. So there are costs to testing, but there are also costs to not testing. And so a program manager might say, well, we're going to skip this. Testing is too expensive. And once upon a time, I had a program manager who said, we're not going to do any unit testing on this program. We're just going to do system testing and we'll find our problems there. And we found them and found them and found them and found them. Things that we could have found much earlier and much less expensively. So testing is the most time-consuming part. It's probably the most expensive part of software development. But if we don't test, then we are potentially even more expensive because we are now allowing the potential for failures to escape out to our users, which could, in some of the examples that I showed you, be really quite catastrophic. And if we do too little testing early, the cost of testing increases. So the earlier we test, the less expensive it is. And here's an example of that. This is also a little bit dated. It's from around, well, I think it's from around 2010, although I've changed it to 2019 dollars. The green fall, or sorry, the yellow bars. The yellow bars show where are we making errors. Okay, and we make some errors in our requirements and we make some errors in our design, but we make most of our errors when we're actually writing the code. The green bars show where do we find typically our errors. Well, we find a few of our requirements errors and we find a few of our design errors and we find a few errors during coding, but mostly we find our errors later during system test, just like that example that I talked about. The problem is this red line. Finding defects at requirements time or at design time or even at coding time is relatively inexpensive. Finding them at functional test or at system test, or worst of all, in operational use, right? The later we find the problems, the more expensive they are. So we want to take these green bars and we want to push them, well, this way is left for me. I'm not sure which way is left for you. We want to push them left on this chart. We want to find things earlier because it's less expensive that way.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
How does that work with like software testing at a requirements phase? Right,
yeah, so software testing at a requirements phase is difficult because if you're, this chart is presuming a waterfall life cycle. Okay, we do all the requirements, then we do all the design, then we do all the coding, then we do all the testing. More and more frequently, programs aren't really working that way strictly, right? Because that's not a great way to work. But presuming that model, you can't really do software testing at the requirements phase because you don't have the software yet. But what you can do at the requirements phase is start to think about, how would I test this requirement? Okay, here's 10 requirements. One of them is, you know, the system shall deliver the right groceries. Okay, well now I'm thinking about testing, right? I'm going to put my testing hat on earlier. We're in the requirements phase. We're writing requirements. How am I going to test that the system shall deliver the right groceries? That seems overly broad, right? Overly vague. Can we maybe take that requirement and break it down into more specific things? And then I can think about, oh, okay, I know how I could write a test for that. I could even write that test right now. I can't run it because I have nothing to run it against, but I could even write the test, even if it's just, you know, a document. Okay, the way we're going to test this is to do this and then do this and then do this. And then we can all look at it and go, yep, okay, that seems right. Or, oh no, that actually points out a problem with this requirement, right? So that's how we can do testing at the requirements phase.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. And by the way, I know that, you know, typically every semester, very few people are comfortable kind of interrupting and breaking in the lecture. And I don't have a good way to see raised hands. And I know that Zoom gives you away, but it's really hard for me to even see that. So feel free. I don't mind the interruptions. And if you're more comfortable doing it, you know, interrupting or putting a question in on chat, that's okay too. All right, so a quick summary. What's our goal? Well, our goal is to eliminate faults as much as possible, as early as possible. We want to improve our quality. We want to reduce our cost. We want to preserve our customer satisfaction. And here's my first, my first comic. You're going to see a lot of Dilbert. You're going to see a lot of XKCD because they all just kind of fit right into this. But that brings up another opportunity for online participation. Find me some good software testing or software quality related comics that I can use in my slides. And that will get you a point. All right, so yeah, you've scheduled the end of the test phase. After the start of the production phase, we're feeling confident. I can tell you from long, hard experience, it's not going to work that way. All right, so that takes us to the end of our lecture section. I've got a good, really good question here in the chat. What's the major difference between software testing and software quality assurance? You could probably ask 10 people that question and get 10 different answers, or maybe 11 different answers. I'm going to say that software testing is an aspect of software quality assurance, a big aspect of software quality assurance, but one aspect. Software quality assurance would also need to include other things like what is what is the provenance of the software that we're using? You know, so, okay, I'm using Apache MQ version x.y.z. How safe is that? Are there known bugs against it, right? So quality assurance needs to take into account a lot of different things, not just software testing, but software testing is part of it. All right, we're 5:50 now. Let's go ahead. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll start back up at 6. We're going to do kind of just some quick exercises. We're not breaking up into groups today, so it'll just be kind of chat discussion. And also over the break, think about anything else you'd like to ask from what we've talked about so far. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back. I found my video panel. It was hidden under the 27 other Zoom windows that I had. So let's go ahead and move on to our activity this week, or our class exercise, if you like, whatever you'd like to call them. All right, so our in-class activities or exercises, as I mentioned, they're not graded. They're usually good preparation for the next quiz. This week, we're just going to kind of do this as a group discussion. Next week, it'll be in your Bugwarts group. We're going to break out into Zoom breakout rooms and do your work there, and then we'll kind of all come back together, and each team will get to talk about a particular section of of what you did in the exercise. So again, class participation, I guess I'd update and say, well, it's not really just expected, it's kind of required if you want your full grade, and we've beaten that one to death already, I think, so we'll just move on. All right, so a lot of this course is structured around test coverage. So let's discuss a little bit what coverage is, what it does, what it doesn't do, right? What are the ideas around test coverage? So first of all, what purpose does a test serve? This is the activities section, so these questions are out to you folks. All right, to see if a function runs as intended. Okay, that's not wrong, right? That's correct, but is maybe a little broad. That you get the expected output with given inputs, that's a little more exacting. Test every possible option before it goes to users. That would be ideal, but might not be practical. Find problems in the software that would be problematic in the future. Determine behavior, helps to find bugs. Hey, what did I say about bugs? Right, faults, errors, failures. Ensure the behavior of the code. Okay, sure. And those are all true, although I would say those are more true of testing in general. If we want to talk about a particular test, then it's hard to give an answer to what a particular test is intended to do. But generally, any particular test, as I mentioned earlier, should have a reason. If someone were to come along and say, why did you write that test? You should be able to say, well, because I needed that test in order to, and to give a general answer, I'll say, in order to fill a hole in my test coverage. Whatever my test coverage is, whatever it's measuring, this test serves to do something that I need to do in order to complete my test coverage. All right, testing meeting requirements, behavior of a procedure, verify and validate the software. Yep, all right, good answers. So how would you define test coverage? It's a word we've used now a few times, but we haven't really defined it yet. So voice is good too, and maybe better for this purpose, but how much of the code is tested? Yeah, that's a good start. How would you define how much, or the next answer, what part of the code is tested? How would you define how much or what part of the code is tested? All right, now I'm seeing a lot of other things come in. execute the scope of code that you want to test, amount of testing done, amount of code or logic a test covers, like a percentage of lines. Okay, Blake, that's good. That is a particular, a specific coverage criteria. What's the number of lines that I've executed? Amount of software that's tested based on its requirements. That's another interesting one. Here we're not, if we set requirements as our coverage goal, then maybe less interested in how many lines of code or which lines of code I've tested, but more interested in which requirements I've satisfied. Those are different coverage definitions, but both useful. Make sure every acceptance criteria is covered, how much it covers the domain of the problem. That's another good one, especially if I change it slightly and say the domain of the inputs. That's another good coverage measurement that we'll actually spend a lot of time talking about around mid-semester. What part of the code gets tested? Branch coverage, another good specific example. All possible paths, another good specific example. All right, you guys are on fire here. All right, so we've got a lot of good definitions of test coverage. Let me take all of those and ball them all together and synthesize whatever number Fortify gives me. All right, Kyle, that's a little bit of an inside joke. Let me take all those things, mash them all together, and try to come up with a little more general statement of coverage. Test coverage is the definition of your success criteria. And then when you execute, well, let me rephrase that a little better. Test coverage is the portion of your set of test requirements that you have satisfied. Now, when I say test requirements, I'm not talking about, like somebody mentioned earlier, about the number of system requirements I've satisfied. No, that's not it. A test requirement is a somewhat different thing. So, for example, if I was doing statement coverage, which somebody mentioned, right? I want to execute every line of code. So statement coverage or line coverage. My test requirement would be execute every line of code. Or more specifically, I would have a set of test requirements. The first test requirement would be execute line of code 1. The second test requirement would be execute line of code 2. Right? That would be my set of test requirements. And then my coverage would be a measurement of how many of those have I done. So my test requirements could be 1 for each line. My test requirements could be 1 for each branch. My test requirements could be 1 for each system functional requirement. My test requirements could be 1 requirement for every possible piece of data that I could put in as an input. If you're feeling like that doesn't sound practical, we have ways of making it practical. So my test requirements could be based on a lot of things, but my test coverage is a measurement of how many of those test requirements I've satisfied. So does anybody here have experience with test coverage? And I know the answer is yes by the answers that have come in already about statement and branch and requirements, system requirements. So I think that a lot of you do have experience with test coverage of various kinds. All right, I got a little more complex question here. Is there a separate way to cover the following differently? Okay, line 4. Okay, so this question in the chat is talking about lines of code. So is executing lines 1, 3, and 4, is that different than executing lines 1, 2, and 4? I'd like to take that question and I'd like to kick it down the road a couple of classes because it depends on what our coverage is, right? If I were to do those 2 things, for some coverage criteria, it would satisfy it. For others, it might not. So let's kick that level of detail down the road a little bit. So what's the rationale for test coverage? Why do I care about, well, what do I care about when I'm doing software testing? And why should I care about coverage? As in, how does coverage relate to what I actually care about? Because ultimately, I don't really care about coverage. I mean, my users aren't going to be impressed if I tell them that I have 96% of whatever test requirements I made up. They don't really care. So what do I care about And how does coverage relate to that?
I'll share some of my experience on that. So I work on a software team, but our main user of our software is our ML engineers and our data scientists. And they are really good at level 2 testing. They love to tell us when our software doesn't work.
That's easy, right?
Yeah, they have a great time with it. So I guess for me, finding high coverage requirements, especially that hit all of the branches. And then also we use PyTorch. So I know you mentioned your PhD with testing around data science ML. We have so much trouble with that. It's definitely not an easy thing to find all the possible scenarios with all the hooks and everything.
All right, so given that, what would you be trying to accomplish in your testing?
Have the data scientists not get mad at us?
Okay, so that's actually, I mean, I know you said that jokingly, but that's a real thing, right? You're looking for user satisfaction. And what's going to make the user satisfied? Well, when the software does what they expect it to do, and they can interact with it in a way that makes sense to them.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Yep. All right, great, thank you. So we got a couple others in the chat, and we want to make sure all the edge cases are tested against. Okay, that's a good one. More generally, how robust and scalable the software is. Yeah. All right, so these are all good. I feel like a lot of these have been like kind of poking at the bigger picture, right? What do we really care about? Well, we really care about whether our software meets its requirements. Now, let me talk about that for a minute, because that is a term that rolls off my tongue really easily, because for 30 plus years I've been working in, government and defense contracting, where our customers come to us with giant requirements documents and we need to satisfy all those things. And even I have come to recognize that that is actually not the experience of most of the software development world. Most of the software development world is maybe doing products internally, but you still have requirements, even if it's not a 4-inch thick, system requirements document. You've got product designers who are saying, well, okay, well, we want this new product to do this. And, the user should be able to set what time they want to wake up by doing this. And then it should make this sound when it's time to wake up, right? Simple alarm clock requirements, right? So you have those requirements. Sometimes they're not documented or not well documented, but they are there, right? There's a reason why you're trying to make this software do what it does. And so then how does coverage relate to that? And the answer is, well, it does, but it's a little bit squishy. What we'd like to do is be able to come up with a set of test requirements where we have confidence that if we satisfy these test requirements, then the software will be good for its purpose. And then we need to figure out how to write tests to satisfy those test requirements. So is 100% software, 100% coverage of any sort, whatever coverage type you want to think about, is 100% coverage a rational goal? Is that something that we should realistically shoot for and expect to reach? I have a no. I have a bunch of no's. All right, so somebody tell me why you think not. No, because things are scrolling fast here. We could spend too much time on edge cases and miss more common ones. Okay. Yep, you could certainly have I won't say an infinite number of possible things you could do, but very large numbers of things you could do. So for example, if we had, what do we have earlier? We had an example that counted the number of zeros in an array. There is a practically infinite number of arrays that we could put into this program. And if we decided that our coverage was every possible array, then achieving 100% coverage is not a rational goal. So I've got one. I disagree. You can get line coverage with some sort of automated testing framework. Maybe. Perhaps often. For complex systems, it's near impossible to have 100% software coverage. Okay, so it depends on what we mean by software coverage, but let's assume that you mean statement or branch coverage. For complex software, that can be very, very hard to do, and sometimes it is impossible. In fact, from a formal perspective, and I think you'll find over the course of the semester, I'm sure you all know Paul Ammann. I'm sure you all know Jeff Offit. I've worked with them for many years. Paul was my research advisor. Jeff was sort of, you know, my backup research advisor. They are both very formal thinkers. But I, coming from most of my career in practical software development, I tend to be a less formal thinker. And, you know, I think you'll see that over the course of the semester. But formally, achieving 100% coverage of any criteria is an undecidable problem. Given a piece of software, you cannot tell formally, you cannot prove that you can or cannot satisfy all of the test requirements. So therefore, 100% always, no matter what, period, actually not a rational goal, even though it may be what we shoot for. And does 100% coverage ensure that there are no defects? And I think the answer there, well, I know the answer there is no, because 100%, let's talk about statement coverage for a minute, because it's easy to get your head around, right? I want to execute each line of code. Well, we already saw in our little toy example earlier tonight that even if I execute the line of code, the data that I provide does not necessarily cause an error to occur and does not necessarily cause that error to result in a failure. So given that model where I have to see a failure in order to realize that there is a defect or a fault, then coverage alone cannot ensure that there are no defects. And no, because there may be defects still outside of the tests. Also true. All right, let's move on to number 2. Oh, I want to come back to this one. If you write the code first and then you write the tests, you're trying to test expected behavior. You should write the code with testing in mind. Yeah, I really like that comment, and I'm actually a big fan of test-driven development. We're not really going to dig into test-driven development in this class because there's only so many things we can do. But I know that Paul Ammann has done a kind of a side special topics class several times in test-driven development. I found that to be a really fun class and really convincing, and I try, not always successfully, but I try to use test-driven development techniques when I write code. So thanks for that comment. All right, let's consider a system. And we have some constraints, or if you prefer, some requirements that have been given to us from the system. If the light is red and the valve is open, then release the monster. And if the valve is open and the switch is on, then release the monster. All right, so we got 3 inputs. We've got apparently 1 output, which is to release or not release the monster. This is, of course, anytime someone talks about releasing monsters, this is my go-to monster in my imagination. Although I don't remember which movie this was from. It was certainly from the original Star Wars 3. I think the second one. Not 100% sure. I'm sure someone will tell me because there's got to be a big Star Wars fan here. All right, so given that, what do those constraints mean? Episode 6, or as old people like me like to think, movie 3. What exactly do those constraints mean? And is the problem completely defined? And for this purpose, let's assume that the 3 mentioned inputs are the only 3 inputs. But is the problem completely defined?
So each of the constraints only mentions 2 of the 3 components, so no.
Yeah, each only mentioned 2 of the 3, right? So does that mean that the other one doesn't matter? Maybe. That's a good question, not sure. How many different test cases are possible? And I'll help by going back to the it doesn't clarify if there's dependent behavior. That's true, right? So we're not really sure if the nature of the inputs, are these inputs really independent or are they somehow coupled? Don't know. All right, so the light could be red or not red. Or maybe we could consider the light to be red or yellow or green. Or there's a number of ways we could interpret that, or maybe red or yellow or green or off. And maybe there are even more ways. The valve could be open or closed, or perhaps partially open. I'm not sure. The switch could be on or off. That seems, at least in an ideal situation, like a Boolean input. Yeah, is red a range or a set value? Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we're wondering about this, but let's assume, let's take Aaron's statement here and we'll just work with that. 2 times 2 times 3, so that is maybe 12. And then Kaveh, and pardon me if I'm not pronouncing your name right, and do feel free to correct me. You're saying 3 to the 2. I think that might be 2 to the 3, right? The light is red or not red, the valve is open or not open, the switch is on or not on. So we have 8 or 12 or maybe some other number of inputs, but we'll settle for that. We'll settle for 8 or 12 as both pretty easily justifiable things. Well, what's the desired outcome in each case? Well, here's the problem. We only know the desired outcome in 2 cases, or perhaps 4 cases, right? We know the desired outcome when the light is red and the valve is open and I'm not sure about the switch. Maybe we should assume that the switch is on or off. And we know the outcome when the valve is open and the switch is on and the light is, I don't know, perhaps red or not red, maybe we don't care. But we don't actually know about any of the other outcomes. And when dealing with a system where the release of the monster is presumably consequential, we would maybe like a better definition of all of the possible inputs and all of the possible outcomes. Since we don't know if the monster is hostile or not, the first thing to do with the monster is replace with a cat or dog to simulate the system. You have been reading ahead. All right, we're going to come back to that in a minute. How many different cases do you want to test and justify your choice? So let's assume that there are 8 cases. The light is red or not red. How many of these cases do we want to test? Well, I would argue this seems like it could be a safety critical system. So we would probably want to test all 8 or all 12 because 8's not that hard, right? That's not that many tests. It's not like a million tests. 12 is not that hard. The consequences of getting it wrong are bad. So we'd probably want to test them all in this case. And so now back to the comment. From a practical perspective, when we are doing our testing, what do we not want to happen? Right? We don't want to release the monster. And so Nishat, your statement, the first thing to do is replace the monster with a cat or dog to simulate the system. That is an excellent idea. And in the more general sense, what would we call that in software testing? Mocking. Yeah, mocking is a good answer. It's not the only one. We could say test double, we could say test stub, we could call it mocking, but we'd want to replace the monster with something else so that we can conduct our testing without the nasty side effects of actually releasing the monster. All right, one more thing here. Here we've got a piece of code, max 3. I pass in 3 integers and it's supposed to return me the maximum value of those integers. Stunt double, hey, I like that, yeah. This function is supposed to return the maximum value of these 3 integers. And I've even been so helpful as to tell you where the fault is. And this is a thing you might find on a quiz, right? I'm not, well, I don't know, in simple software, I might ask you to figure out what the fault is, but often I'll just tell you what it is because the issue isn't finding the fault, it's about doing something about it, right? So here's the fault. If I is greater than or equal to j and I is greater than or equal to k, then we set max to k and return it. But we should be setting max to I. So if I call max with 321, does it execute the fault or reach the fault? I got a lot of yeses coming in. All right, if I is greater than or equal to j, and that's true. If I is greater than or equal to k, and that's true, yes, we reach the fault. It seems like it's a unanimous answer. Does that cause an error? Well, error of internal state, yeah, max is now set to 1 instead of 3. That seems like an error. Does it cause a failure? Yeah, well, we come down, we return max, so we return to 1 instead of a 3. That seems like a failure. Great, good job. What if I pass in 333? Does that execute the fault? All right, because of the way the software is written with greater than or equal to, yes, it executes the fault. I is equal to j and I is equal to k, so it gets to the fault. It executes the fault. Does it cause an error? Okay, I'm seeing no's. I'm seeing a not technically, which is an interesting response. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a judgment call. You could say, well, it's an error of internal state because it should have been I and not K, but actually I think you're all on the right track here. Max gets set to 3. And max should be set to 3. So there is no fault. And then the last question is easy. Does it result in a failure? Well, if there's no fault, there's no failure, right? Period. So we're going to return 3. That's the desired outcome. No failure detected. So like I was saying earlier, the fact that you have a defect, a static defect in your code, right? You have this fault, doesn't guarantee that the fault gets executed because I could have put in 1, 2, 3, for example. If I put in 1, 2, 3, then I is not greater than j, and so we jump down to the else, we don't execute the fault. I could also have I less than k. We'd jump over it, wouldn't execute the fault. So the fact that the fault is in there does not ensure an error because I don't necessarily have to reach it. And the fact that I reach it doesn't necessarily cause an error in internal state. And the fact that I create an error in internal state, although this example doesn't show it, the fact that I have an error in internal state does not necessarily mean that error is going to result in an externally observable failure. So we have a pretty complex chain of events. And next week, we will be talking about kind of the logical model to help us, to help us define these 3 things. It's actually going to turn into 4 things, but you're getting the idea, right? I have to get to the fault. The fault has to cause an internal problem. That problem has to get to an output somewhere, and then I have to be able to see that the output's not right. So we'll talk about that more last week. You said if there's no error, there's no failure. Oh, you meant if there's no error, there's no failure. You said no fault. Oh, well, okay, so both of those are true. If there's no fault, then obviously there's no failure, but that wasn't what I meant, so thank you. Even I get the nomenclature mixed up. Yes, you can have a fault, but if the fault doesn't result in an error, then you can't have a failure because you have to have a fault that leads to an error that leads to a failure. And if you break that chain anywhere along the way, then there's no failure. All right, that takes us to the end for tonight. I did promise you an early finish. I have delivered. Any questions? Anything we want to talk about tonight? Questions? Are answers for class activities available after class? Okay, 2-part question. The answer to the first thing is yes. Normally what I will do, because tonight is just kind of a discussion thing, I didn't do it for week 1. Normally I have 2 versions of the class activities. I post the one without answers before class, we work through it, and then I will go over the one with the answers, and I will post that at the end of class. So after class, you're able to go back and see the class activities with answers. Do we have access to the class activity questions before class? Yes, I will normally post the lecture slides and the class activities typically the day before. And our recordings posted on Zoom? Yes. My old lectures are on YouTube. These will be posted on Zoom. I may move them over to YouTube if I feel like they're good. Oh, my Roomba is starting. That's something I'm going to have to reschedule for Monday nights. Yes, but all the lectures will be on YouTube. So if you miss the class or you just choose to take the class asynchronously, you will find it all there. Where will quizzes be posted? Quizzes are on Blackboard. They're in the assessments section, and assignments are in the assignment section. And so actually, let me go back just a moment. If I can find the right thing, here's the course overview. Good. Schedule. Here we go. Here's the schedule. Okay, so assignment 1 is due before the start of class next week. You're going to find assignment 1 really easy. It's basically just introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, what you're interested in, what your software experience is. This is 2 paragraphs. It's a 5-minute assignment. And there's also quiz number 1 is posted. It will become active in half an hour at 7 o'clock. Quiz number 1 is due by the end of the day this Thursday. Again, the quizzes are on Blackboard in the assessments section. The assignments are in Blackboard in the assignments section. So tried to make that easy. All right, anything else to discuss tonight?
Is there an assignment for this week?
Yes, so assignment 1, it is posted or should be posted. Let me know if it's not posted and I'll fix it right away. Unfortunately, in Blackboard, I don't easily get to see Blackboard the way you get to see Blackboard, especially if you have a specific question about yourself. I can't see Blackboard as you. I can see it as if I was a generic student, but I can't see it as you. So that can be a little limiting. But if any time there's something, hey, I expected to see the slides, I don't see them, please do let me know, because sometimes, you know, hey, maybe I just forgot, or maybe I didn't do it right or put it in the right place. These things happen. All right, so I think then we're all set. And we'll see you next week. What is Discord used for? I don't use Discord for anything. So I am assuming, I'm not sure where you got that from. It certainly wasn't in the syllabus. So not on Discord. Don't necessarily love Blackboard, but I decided to kind of keep it all in one place. Maybe getting ahead, but is the 10-11 weeks quiz still going to be due on Thursday? Yeah, I think it probably will. I'll make a final decision on that by the week before. We have a quiz today, correct? Yes, the quiz is posted in Blackboard. It will appear at 7 o'clock, which is supposed to be the end of class. And again, it's due by the end of the day, Thursday. So you've got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, three days plus a little bit of time tonight to do the quiz. All right, so it's a pleasure having you here. I'm looking forward to spending the semester with you. I know that there are a few of you here tonight that aren't actually in the class yet. You're on the waiting list. At this point, I can just say, well, we'll see what happens.
And the assignments due Monday?
The assignments due Monday by start of class, yes. Yep. All right, so I think that's it. You can certainly email me with any questions. I would say email me with questions if they're specific to you. But if you have more general questions about the class, then go ahead and post them in the Blackboard discussion, because if you've got a question, probably somebody else has that same question too. I can answer it first. I need to be scarier so you can get off the wait list. Yeah. I have no idea why this class has like hit double, it's more than double its usual, its usual interest this semester. No idea. But like I said, I'm guessing it's because there maybe just aren't a lot of other classes that people need this semester. I don't know. But we'll try to have fun. We'll try not to be scary, and you know, hopefully you will find this subject matter to be really interesting and useful to you. And I'm going to strive for both. All right. Have a good night, everybody. See you next week.